Okay, so next is a wonderful principle that we call foot, hip, shoulder, elbow, wrist, palm. Now that little sequence, you can imagine, as the energy is coming up through the body and must naturally follow this sequence. So if we think about all these other things that we've just been working on, okay, so here's the start of the movement, we'll say. And we'll do ward off left. Okay, here's the start of the movement, basically. I've gathered the inside of the foot. I'm relaxed. Hips closed, eyes soft, head upright. There's a little feeling here. Now, as I start to move forward, there's a sequence. Foot. First, the foot starts to press. As the foot presses down, the hip starts to open. It starts to open just as soon as the chi starts pressing downward, the hip starts opening. Heel to hip. As soon as the hip gets activated, the waist starts to turn. Heel, hip, waist. As soon as the waist starts to activate, the shoulder starts to open. Open. Heel to hip to waist to shoulder. As soon as the shoulder starts to activate, the elbow starts to open. Heel to hip to waist to shoulder to elbow. When the elbow starts to open, the wrist starts to open and palm starts to open. We say La Kung point. It's easier to see in like this push movement. Okay. Heel to hip. Heel to hip. Hip to waist. Hip to waist. Waist to shoulder. Waist to shoulder. Shoulder to elbow. Shoulder to elbow. Elbow to wrist. Elbow to wrist. Wrist to palm. Wrist to palm. So I wouldn't do or for the movement to be harmonious, it must follow this pattern. Foot to hip, hip to waist, waist to shoulder, shoulder to elbow, elbow to wrist, wrist to palm. And then it withdraws back in. In the same way, palm to wrist, to elbow, to shoulder, to waist, to hip, to foot. And you can see it really clearly in push, for instance. Okay. Push. Foot. Foot to hip, hip to shoulder, shoulder to elbow, elbow to wrist, to palm, and back. Palm, elbow, shoulder, wrist. Now this is going to keep you from doing things like this. Or, you see? This is very important for the harmony of the movement. Foot to hip, hip to shoulder, elbow, wrist, palm. Wrist, palm, bam, 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 back. Okay? So no matter what the movement, for instance, single whip, when you've got two going in opposite directions, it's still the same thing. Foot to hip, hip to waist, waist to shoulder, to elbow, to palm. And then relaxes. Even when you're closing, foot to hip, hip to shoulders, shoulders to elbows, elbows to wrist, and palm. Even when you're closing, it's still the same thing. So this is very, very, very important for the beauty and harmony of the movement. And it'll change if you haven't been consciously doing this, and you do it consciously, it will change so much for you in your enjoyment and energy movement flow. Okay, so there's another element that we've added in to this whole little book of yin yang. You see, yin to yang, but it's not like on or off. It's a dimmer switch. It's a dimmer switch. You know that it moves. It's brighter, 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 brighter. Dimmer, 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 dimmer. It's not like all of a sudden, although I guess it could be. But even if it goes that fast, it's going to pass through all of those same elements of going brighter and going, slower. Okay.